Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя. Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя. Hey, babe. Эти понты покупались во рту. Твои мозги затупились к утру. Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя. Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя. Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя. Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один, прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лик, поцелуй на шее. Капли дамба, правый назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степь многоярд. Мог тебя взять, но ты не моя.
On this 80th anniversary of Leningrad, the turning point of World War II, it's a great time to watch this series. The Unknown War was a 1978 documentary film, 20 hours long. It was co-produced by Burt Lancaster with the rare total cooperation of the Soviet Union. It aired on television in the United States and the USSR. The story behind this classic film is even more interesting than the series itself. We'll unpack that in this video. The Unknown War is the only American Cold War-era documentary series I've ever seen that does not demonize the Soviets or make Stalin into Lucifer. Burt Lancaster spared no expense on research and made sure that this 20-part documentary was accurate in every detail. The footage you see here was edited from over 3.5 million feet of film taken by Soviet camera crews from the first day of the war during Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941 through August of 1945. Most of these films have never been seen in the West outside of this documentary series. Burt Lancaster had the full cooperation of the Soviet Union in making this film. It was shot on location around the Soviet Union with a Russian crew. The full series aired on television in both the USSR and the USA a remarkable brief moment of Cold War cooperation between the superpowers. The series debuted on June 22, 1978, 37 years after Operation Barbarossa began. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, several American TV stations, responding to public outcry, pulled the series off the air. The Unknown War series wasn't seen again in the United States until it was released on a 5-disc DVD set in 2011. But why was it called The Unknown War, you might ask? American co-producer Fred Weiner had dreamed up the idea of this television series after his 1976 visit to Russia that impressed him with his own ignorance of the sacrifice and the heroism of the Russians in the Second World War. It's unknown because Americans weren't told of Russia's heroism. If you grew up during the Cold War, you were probably taught in school that the Americans and the British and the French beat the Nazis. Well, that's not true. Russia did the heavy lifting on the Eastern Front and suffered by far the heaviest casualties. The American producer working with the Soviets to produce this series later said that he was deeply moved by the friendly spirit of it. He said, "We saw that they had sincere wishes for the truth. They wanted to tell Americans about the sacrifices of the Soviet Union during the war." No one got closer to the frontline action than these photographers. Some of the sequences are positively unbelievable. In some cases, they went beyond their own lines to film things. The rare Soviet war footage was shot by a special 250-member film unit embedded with the troops. The Red Army's film crew's work was so dangerous, in fact, that 50 of the 250 photographers perished in service to bring you the footage you see here. At first, I was unhappy with the title, The Unknown War, said Russian co-producer Carmen, because this war was known so well by us, the Russians. But now I am happy. This is a clever thing. It's a little ironic, but aimed at the post-war generations who know nothing of the war. He said, "I was talking recently with some young Americans and asked them what they knew of the Second World War. They asked me if that was the time the Americans and the British fought the Russians." In 1978, the young Americans' reaction was bizarre to this proud Soviet. "Look," he emphasized, "this is a country where 20 million people lost their lives in World War II. This is incomprehensible to the American people." The Unknown War is available for streaming on Tubi, Amazon, Apple, YouTube, and other digital platforms for a small fee. There is a lower quality version taped from television on VHS tape that's available in its entirety for free, all 20 episodes, and I will put a link in the description if you'd like to check it out. In 1978, many veterans of World War II were still living. This film was made for them. Seeing all the elderly Soviet widows placing flowers on their husbands' graves just breaks your heart. Here's how the Unknown War looked to audiences in the Soviet Union on Soviet television.
Для советского народа это была Великая Отечественная война. Он вел ее во имя свободы и независимости своей социалистической родины, во имя избавления Европы, да и всего мира от фашистского порабощения. 20 миллионов жизней советских людей унесла эта война. Наш народ не забудет ее никогда. Леонид Ильич Брежнев.
The beautiful statue behind me is that of the Russian Emperor Peter the Great, here in the city which he founded, St. Petersburg, now called Leningrad. Peter called this port city Russia's window to Europe. Hello, I'm Burt Lancaster. Let me tell you something about Leningrad's fascinating history. In 1917, Leningrad was the site of the October Revolution, which signaled the end of the Tsarist regime and the beginning of the Soviet state. When Lenin died, the city was renamed in his memory. In the history of the unknown war, Leningrad stands out as a symbol of the courage and persistence of the Russian people. For days, weeks, months, years, Leningrad resisted capture by Hitler's forces. In the aching cold of winter, with nothing to eat, no way to keep warm, hundreds of thousands of Leningraders perished from starvation or simply froze to death. Still, they fought on. During the terrifying siege, which the Russians call the 900 days, Nazi troops encircled the city and cut off all communications. But Leningrad would not surrender. And now, that story, the siege of Leningrad. Leningrad, founded by Peter the Great on the marshes of the Neva River, one of the world's most beautiful cities, often called the Venice of the North, an extraordinary city that enjoys a very special place in the hearts of its citizens. These Leningraders are the heirs of a unique past. They are ordinary people, ordinary men, women, children. Like people everywhere, they fall in love, marry, raise families. And dream dreams. In 1941, there were over 2.5 million people in Leningrad. For them, the war would be different. Success or failure would depend as much on their strength as on the brilliance of the generals. 2.5 million Leningraders. 1 out of every 3 of them would die of starvation, of bombs, of shells, of sub-zero cold. They would die by the hundreds of thousands, men, women, children. Within days of the Nazi attack on Russia, on June 22nd, 1941, Lithuania and Latvia had been overrun, and the Germans were moving deliberately on Leningrad with over 1 million troops, 600 tanks, and 1,000 planes. Their allies, the Finns, were also poised for the attack north of the city. Nazi panzer divisions smashed into ancient Pskov, crushing everything in their path. The road to Leningrad was in flames. symbols of Russian culture and style were known to the world. In this cradle of Russian scholarship and art, the poet Pushkin wrote. The composer Mussorgsky wrote his music in Leningrad. Pavlov experimented with dogs on conditioned reflexes. The ballerina Pavlova danced in classical ballet for Russian Grand Dukes. It was in Leningrad that Lenin and the Bolsheviks changed the world's political structure in 1917. The German Army Group Nord was expected to conquer Leningrad in 4 weeks, by July 21st, 1941. On the ground were the 16th and the 18th Field Armies and the 4th Tank Group of the Wehrmacht. Hitler was determined to capture Leningrad quickly and then send the same forces to envelop Moscow.
Hitler didn't intend to simply take Leningrad. He intended to erase it from the face of the earth, killing all inhabitants. Hitler's reason was that he wanted to, quote, destroy all remnants of their communist revolution. This is explained in episode 3 of The Unknown War on Leningrad. Hitler lusted after the Donbass region of the Soviet Union for the same reason that Russia and Ukraine want to conquer it now: resources. Episode 4 covers Ukraine in World War II and contains some very rare footage of the territory where blood spills right now.
The sky pulsed with the rustle of wings, many wings. Air attacks on Leningrad had begun September 6th, but the first intensive raid was September 8th. The Germans came that night in 2 main waves. The first wave at 6:55 p.m. dropped over 6,000 incendiary bombs. At 10:35 p.m., a second wave of bombers dropped high explosive bombs of 500 to 1,000 pounds. That day's air raid destroyed the Badaev warehouses, the city's main stockpile of food. It was an evil omen. Food was soon to become more precious than bullets. With the bombs, the Nazis dropped leaflets. Today we shall do the bombing. Tomorrow you shall do the burying.
The forced starvation the Nazis imposed upon the city of Leningrad cost 600,000 lives. So many infants died of malnutrition, including current Russian President Vladimir Putin's elder brother Viktor, who was only 2 years old. He is buried in a mass grave.
Blockaded, Leningrad had hardly enough food to sustain life. Bread was made from wood cellulose and the dust from flour mills, mixed with cottonseed cake, as bitter as quinine. The ration was 2 slices a day, 4.5 ounces. They mixed cookies out of carpenter's glue and fried them in turpentine or paint. By now, people were scraping the wallpaper off their walls to eat the paste. Soldiers volunteered to cut down their own rations to help the civilians. But this was impossible. Soldiers needed strength to fight. To lose a ration card meant almost certain death. In November, the hunger deaths began. They would reach a total of more than 600,000 before the siege ended. There was a certain order about death in Leningrad. The elderly went first, quietly. Men died before women, then teenagers. Death could come at any moment, in any place. Even to infants, gone before they had a chance to live. The birth rate dropped to zero. People began falling on the streets, dying where they lay. For the living, the corpses were evidence of their own fragile hold on life. Even some who tried to drag their own dead to the cemeteries themselves died on the way. Those who survived fought on. Nazi pressure was unrelenting. The temperature was dropping. It reached 5 below on the 14th of November. As the winter wore on, it seemed that even the meager bread ration might vanish. It didn't matter to this woman, who remembers what it was like.
I came in and said, Papa, I won't eat my bread ration. If I stay alive, I want to show posterity what kind of bread we had to eat in the siege. My father said, you'll die. I said that if I eat it, I still may die. And perhaps even if I don't eat it, I may still stay alive. Oh, it was so terrible. That's why I wanted to keep that bread, so the children could see it and know how we lived. It's hard to imagine now what we had to endure during the blockade to survive.
Трудно сейчас даже представить, что нам пришлось блокаду пережить.
Russian composer Dmitri Shostakovich was actually a victim of Stalinist repression in the USSR. But when Stalin commissioned him to compose a symphony for the war effort, Shostakovich rose to the occasion in service to his country, composing his 7th symphony, the Leningrad. Shostakovich died 50 years ago, but his music continues to infuriate dictatorial regimes. If I had this CD in my possession in Ukraine today, I could be arrested as part of the Zelensky regime's crackdown on all Russian music, art, and culture. The Leningrad, or the 7th Symphony, was Shostakovich's great World War II symphony. It had its premiere 82 years ago, in 1942, during the siege of Russia in Leningrad. While the Nazis bombarded the city, the Red Army's cannons remained silent for the duration of the performance. The Leningrad Symphony was widely revered and performed in the Allied nations during World War II, including 60 performances in the United States. Shostakovich's 7th became an anthem to victory. The composer was honored on the cover of Time magazine in 1942, wearing his Soviet Army fireman's uniform as the city of Leningrad is seen burning in the distance. In all its aspects, the Leningrad Symphony was a punch in the face for Hitler. His racial hatred of the Soviet people cast them as savage and cultureless. The Nazis clamored about Jewish and Bolshevik cultural influence and the need to cleanse art of this racial contamination. But here was a masterpiece being performed, directly defying the Nazi hordes in the great cultural center of Russia. The Nazis had promised to destroy Leningrad, and Shostakovich's symphony let them know that they were going to fail.
Dmitri Shostakovich was finishing his 7th symphony. He called it his Leningrad Symphony. It was to be performed in Leningrad in the Philharmonic's damaged concert hall, while German shells still burst outside. The musicians came from the front line for the occasion. A generation later, the remnants of the same orchestra reassembled to perform the same masterpiece to the original audience. Only the survivors of the war were there. The conductor, Elias Berg, was one of the few who had survived.
Episode 13 of The Unknown War contains rare footage from Soviet archives depicting the same territory in Ukraine that are key battlefields today. The liberation of Ukraine covers the Red Armies taking Ukraine back from the Nazis in 1944 and 1945. In this episode, you'll hear the city of Stalin mentioned often. The city, known today as Donetsk, was named after Joseph Stalin in 1924 and later changed to Stalino in 1929. Soviet Premier Khrushchev changed it to Donetsk in 1961 as part of the de-Stalinization of Ukraine. Also in this episode, you'll see aerial footage of what Kiev looked like when the Nazis were done with it. It was nothing but a pile of rubble.
In Leningrad, they, the children, discovered early what it was to bury a mother or a father. One of the children, Tanya Savicheva, kept a diary throughout the siege. Zhenya died December 28, 12:30 in the morning, 1941. Grandma died January 25th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Uncle Vasya died April 13th at 2 o'clock in the morning, 1942. Loka died March 17th at 5 o'clock in the morning, 1942. Uncle Losha, May 10th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1942. Mama, May 13th at 7:30 in the morning, 1942. The Savichevs died, all died. Only Tanya is left. And then, too, Tanya died. Today in Leningrad, the memories are not allowed to die. This is Piskarevskoye Cemetery. It's quiet now in this great expanse of Leningrad soil, in spite of the visitors. A fitting quiet. For 600,000 people are buried here, some say more. The total number of dead from the siege of Leningrad may have been as high as 1 million, and most were claimed by famine. Today in Leningrad, it's difficult to find anyone, any family, who did not lose a loved one during the 900 days. This tragedy will never be forgotten by those who survived. No disaster ever visited on a city exceeds in magnitude or intensity the suffering of those 900 days. Mama, I returned the bread that you gave me. The mothers recall what they lost, the young, the innocent, the brave. This is the actual banner which the Russian troops planted on top of the Reichstag after they seized Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Now you see it in the Museum of the Soviet Armed Forces in Moscow. It's a sacred Russian relic, a memory of the last deciding battle of World War II. To the Soviet army, the capture of Berlin was the culmination of their drive to avenge the ravaging of their homeland. As the Soviets were fighting their way into the heart of the city, Hitler mobilized his last reserves. Children, as young as 14 and 15, were called up to fight veteran Red Army soldiers. Hitler, Goebbels, Goering, and the other top leaders of the Third Reich had retreated to a bunker. In that underground shelter, Hitler and Goebbels took their own lives. The war against Hitler was over. The Germans had lost. The last major battle of the unknown war had been fought, and peace had come to Europe.
If not for this Soviet victory, we'd probably all be speaking German today. Perhaps, not surprisingly, the FBI stalked Burt Lancaster for decades, suspecting him of communist sympathies. His FBI file seems to have begun in 1963, but the United States government started tracking his activities nearly 15 years earlier. The timing of J. Edgar Hoover opening an investigation of Burt Lancaster coincided rather suspiciously with his starring in the 1963 political thriller 7 Days in May, at the behest of President Kennedy, who assisted in getting the novel made into a movie. In 1962, someone from the CIA forwarded a letter to the FBI in which an unnamed person noted with alarm that Burt Lancaster was, quote, among those in Hollywood who desired to make pictures with strong social commentary. His FBI file, declassified in 1996, states that Burt Lancaster was investigated, quote, for affiliation with the Communist Party of America in the 1940s, for alleged homosexual behavior in the 1950s, and participating in the activities of the Civil Rights Congress in the 1960s. Burt Lancaster's FBI file was publicly released 2 years after his death. A stroke in 1990 had forced him to retire. 4 years later, he died from a heart attack at age 80.
Leningrad is not afraid of death, they said. Death is afraid of Leningrad. It was more than stubbornness, more than determination. It was a quiet, indestructible dedication that lasted until death. Death that took almost all of these.
I'm Laurie Spencer. Thanks for watching.
А кто Берлин-то взял штурмом? Американцы, что ли? Англичане или французы? Красная армия. Подзабыли?
Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один прогуляюсь без тени.
А кто Берлин-то взял штурмом? Американцы, что ли? Англичане или французы? Красная армия. Подзабыли?
Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один.